Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of Great Women in Compliance, sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insights and hosted by the Compliance Podcast Network. I am Hema Lomax, your co host, and I'm super excited today to interview my first great gentleman in compliance, Rupert Evill. No joke, I have found myself quoting Rupert's talk tracks multiple times a day, so much so that I wrote to him and I said, I need to get you out of my head, Rupert, and onto the podcast. So, Rupert, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Oh, well, the pleasure is all mine. So Rupert's a fellow Brit who's joining us from Sussex in England today. He's the founder of Ethics Insight and the author of Bootstrapping Ethics, Integrity Risk Management for Real-World Application, and the newsletter Making Risk Relevant. He has worked in over 50 countries in more than 30 different sectors on the front lines of sustainability, investigations, security, and human rights and integrity issues. So, Rupert, so much there. And I want to spend a lot of time today talking to you about some of my favorite quotes from your book and your books and your writing and your podcasts. Specifically, you focus on three themes where risk management is not relevant, not realistic, and not right sized. So, I really want to dig deep in with those to you today and spend some time unpacking those. But before we do that, for our listeners who might not be familiar with you or your experience, please share a little bit about yourself and how you came to be doing this work.
Sure, it's a pretty accidental career path. So I studied business, international relations, and sustainability at university. And when I graduated, there weren't many sort of jobs back in 2000, 2001 in sustainability. I was looking for something interesting, and I fell into hard risk like security, political risk, kidnap, extortion, those sort of crisis-led situations. And so this is like the post 9/11 era. And what I learned then, I didn't realize would be more useful down the track, was that in those situations, the insight guidance has to be actionable immediately. You don't have time to, when there's an active sort of shooter incident, to go, hang on, let's dust off the crisis management manual and I'll read it in a couple of hours and get back to you. And so that was very instructive. But then they had this sort of investigative, I don't know what you would call it, like nosiness that I needed to satisfy. So I moved into investigations around 2006. And that was very interesting. It partly responsive, but also proactive stuff like due diligence, intel gathering, and even counter-espionage. And then I moved across to Asia in 2010, where I spent the next 12 years. And the shift then is where I started to see the kind of nexus between all of the things we're now talking about: political risk, environmental, business, integrity, security, where it all would come together in these very sort of complex cases, initially investigative and crisis-led. And then over the years, it became more proactive as organizations tried to avoid the issues that they'd been experiencing. And in 2019, I started my own business because I recognized that a lot of the big firms have got resources and they have access to good advisors, but maybe the next tier down, who bear a lot of the exposure, the mid-caps and the SMEs, they don't have that same support. So I wanted to try and work with that more underserved market.
So smart. What a rich experience. And as ever, when you talk, I hear you and I'm like, oh, must remember that. Immediately actionable is such an important phrase. I'm going to start using that one. You're right. In the context that you described, it's obvious that you need to be immediately actionable. Like you said, active shooter, terrorism, whatever it might be. But I think our listeners, that will resonate with them. We need to start having guidance that's immediately actionable too. I'll tell you, our business partners are not interested in waiting for us to dust off the tomb either. So, love to, as we dive in today, love to hear how that translates and what you learned there. It's the holy grail, really, of compliance work and risk management work, is to make your work immediately actionable, make what you're doing actionable. I know, just staying with your experience a bit, I think one of your first roles was actually in communications. Am I right?
Oh yeah, that was an internship. So it was hilarious. It was basically this company that does the software that behind all the booking systems, and
Okay.
they're based in France. And they were trying to sign a multi-year deal with BA. So my job was to be someone who could understand what the French team wanted to do and translate that into sort of something the BA, which then was a very traditional organization, might find acceptable. So it was like one of those sitcoms. I was basically sat between these two cultures that are next to each other, but have so little in common, both in many ways, like organizational, like attitudes to hierarchy, ways of communicating, that kind of stuff. And yeah, so it was fun. And I guess that's why I still nerd out on things like Erin Meyer's work about the culture gap. And I find it super interesting how challenging it can be to migrate ideas across different cultures.
Yeah, no, it's challenging, but also like imperative for us to figure out how to market and communicate and message. And to your point, bridge gaps and interpret. So, yeah, no,
Yeah.
powerful stuff. A mere internship, but probably set you up for great success and all those other exciting experiences.
I, I must admit, it probably wasn't my finest hour in terms of diligent, being a diligent employee, because it wasn't Côte d'Azur in the south of France. So I just couldn't wait to get out the door every day and go to the beach. But yeah,
Hey, you
probably wasn't the hardest working job of my life, but you
probably
know.
had your priorities right back then. We could all do it with a bit more rebalancing towards the beach. So, no, I got you. Okay, so let's turn to those three themes. I'm fascinated by this. It's so much rich content. So let's start with it. As I said, where risk management is not relevant, not realistic, and not right size. We're going to go to relevant first. So one of the first talk tracks that I used almost daily when I heard about you, read your newsletter was making risk relevant. In fact, the name of your newsletter. And I think one of your basic premises, I'm going to be quoting you the whole hour, but one of your basic premises is that if risk is ever to be relevant, it must start with more personal and human constructs, i.e., our values, our ethics, and beliefs. Again, resonates with me 100%. Talk to us about human centered risk management and why that's important to you.
Okay, I guess maybe it's easier to think from the point of view of user experience. So when you buy the really good tech products these days, you can just take it out of the packet. And most of the time, intuitively, you can start to work it. If you can't, they might have a quick start guide that's never more than a few little drawings and pages. And there may still be that manual that sits behind it. I think that there are lots of organizations that do it fantastically. And I know you do from having read your stuff, but there are still organizations that maybe approach trying to communicate on risk from the point of view of explaining how, for starting with the long form manual.
Mm.
So like the FCPA came into force in the 1970s. The reason for it was this, here's the top 10 fines. And you're 20 minutes in and the audience, if you, let's say you're talking to a team in a fast developing country, they're like, okay, why does this matter? Why do I care? Whereas maybe we need to think about bringing that item out of the package at the beginning. So just start, if you want to talk to people about anti-corruption, start with where in your life outside of work have you come across anti-corruption? And then people go, oh, the top on my street. I try and get into the doctors, they expected a bribe, or my teacher. For the teacher of my child wants to ask for a fruit basket in this new year if they're going to probably grade the papers. And then when you're talking in a more benign sense, so you're not asking about what people think at work, you start to get that lexicon going, and then you become more of a partner. Okay, so how we don't want to do this within the organization? How are we going to achieve this in this setting? And I think it's just it's where you're starting from. You're starting from unboxing the item that you're there to deal with, rather than here's an abstract manual and we'll get to the item at the last 5 minutes.
Brilliant. Again, there's another one. Unboxing the item, unboxing what we're trying to convey, I think is a really good metaphor for it. And you remind me of one of my latest obsessions with it, which is think about the employee experience. When,
Yes.
how are they receiving us as a function, and what is it we're doing to make sure their experience is seamless and easy to access? No, I really like that. It's so important for us to not be checkboxing. We taught them the law, we told them what the penalties were, thinking about the regulators as opposed to thinking about the humans we're serving. So there's a service element here in our role. Do you agree with that in terms of the service piece?
Oh, absolutely. I think I remember I got a friend in Singapore, and he's a mechanic, but he just said everyone's selling something.
Yeah.
And because I was talking to him about my discomfort when I moved into my own business and having to sell myself, which is something that's quite awkward. And he said, oh, don't worry about it. Everyone's selling something. If you're in any function within an organization, if there's no consumers of your content, then why are you there? If people don't want you and need you and you're not adding some sort of value. So I think definitely we have to think of whoever we're working with are the employees, the people who most need that support as customers. And we have to think about how do we best serve the customer. And so that often, I think we'll get onto it a bit more in sort of decision making, but to the point about the law thing, I got a researcher to look at big codes of conduct and the decision making frameworks they have in them. And pretty much all of them are a variation of, is it in compliance with the law, compliance with our code? And in the world that we're living in, that's a big ask. I work in this area, but I'm not a qualified lawyer. If you asked me to say, is it legal about, I don't know, something to do with cross-border tax or, I don't know, data privacy, I don't know. You're really putting me, but if you just explain to me the basic construct, since that we have to have a very legitimate reason to gather that information and we can't be transmitting it to somewhere where we don't know how it's going to be held and stored. Oh, now I get it. And so it's just about taking something that can be very daunting. And I think that a lot of the people who work in this area are highly educated, which unfortunately can be a curse, because there's this thing, the curse of knowledge. And we struggle sometimes to conceptualize how someone else wouldn't know that. Oh, surely they'd know that. And I think when we step out of that and assume nothing and think of it from the point of view of the user, then it becomes, I guess we get a lot better, because ditching our own curse of knowledge.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I think, look, part of human centered, what I'm hearing is just simplicity, right? And being relevant,
Yes.
to your point, being relevant, making it relevant. I love the question, what are we selling? I ask that a lot of myself and my peers. So what are we selling as compliance professionals? My answer this year is ease and peace of mind, right? Back to your
Yes.
unboxing. I want people to have ease with their, facilitate, back to the word ease, right? Facilitate ethical decision making. Have peace of mind that you can go forward with safety, knowing you've done the right thing and ask the right questions of yourself. No, I love that.
Yeah.
So you've given us a couple tips then on unboxing. You probably know from the last podcast I did with Sabrina where I mentioned you. One of my
Yes.
favorite topics is objective centers risk management. And what I mean by that is focus on the actual objectives of the people you're trying to help. So that,
Yes.
again, you're talking in their language about the thing they care about. If they've set out their objectives for the year, what better than to talk about how there are vulnerabilities with their own objectives rather than some abstract bribery might happen in some jurisdiction. I know you talk about I'm going to go effective risk assessments, just
Yeah.
asking the W questions. What are you doing with whom, why, where, and when, and how? Tell us more about your philosophy on risk assessments and trying to get to objective centered risk management.
I think that Sabrina and I are pretty aligned on this one. The having, and I think I talked about this before. I remember when I started with risk assessments, the organization I was working with had a very defined methodology about how impact and likelihood was categorized, and that you had this big kind of risk matrix. And I remember traveling across Asia with this sort of rolled up laminated risk matrix we'd used, which you had to transport in this thing that looked like a bazooka, which meant going through customs was fun. And you get there and you stick it on the wall and you give everyone post-its, and then you'd explain to them about likelihood and impact. And then you wonder why people were sticking the same risk in wildly different places all over the shop. And so when I started to have to rethink about the whole way I wanted to make the premise, I guess I started from is when I started the business is I don't think we're doing this terribly well, because otherwise all these risk indicators will be improving. They're actually plateauing or deteriorating. So let's take all the conventional wisdom and throw it out. And I found some super interesting research. Some of it's been around for decades. NATO did a study in the 60s where they asked people on a scale to map by percentage terms, what does probable or likely or these, and it's this huge curves.
Mhm.
And so just the linguistics behind it are problematic. The easiest way around that, if you still have to calibrate, is use numbers. That's a universal language. And then at that median point, we tend to be a bit more accurate. If you are an organization, often for regulatory reasons, that needs to have your risk register or needs to categorize, at least do it using the universal language. But more, if you can, avoid all of that likelihood, impact, consequences stuff when you're talking to people, because it's going to be alien to them. But when we start to ask, what do you do? Who do you do it with? How do you do it? And when is a huge one. But and when can be how often. We're talking about frequency, seasonal kind of peaks and troughs, criticality. If they sit in your critical path, or without this one license, we're done for the year, or we're an organization that relies on winning 2 big tenders a year versus we're an online retailer selling a gazillion things a day. The understanding how those who, what, when, how questions, you're doing a risk assessment by stealth, essentially, and it's a lot less confrontational than going into someone and going, in your area of operations, tell me where you have exposure, and I'm your friend, I'm from compliance, but I also oversee investigations as well, which is a tough sell. And what I'm now doing is evolution of that is I'm torturing ikigai, which is a concept a lot of people will be familiar with in terms of Japanese model about how you find your kind of North Star professionally, which is what the world needs, what you're good at, what you love, what you can get paid for. And so I'm looking at that in an organizational setting. So what is the mission and the goals of the organization? What the stakeholders need? Where do the impacts and risks sit? And where do you have skills and capacity? So then when you start to align risk with the internal skills and capacity, stakeholder needs, and organizational strategy, it becomes a lot more relevant to prioritize.
Oh, I love it. There you go, another framework to mature our journey towards objective-centered risk management. That's brilliant. Yeah, I love it. And again, it's you also underlying what you said, you're crowdsourcing the risk intelligence there. You're getting people to want to speak to you because they're speaking about what they want and what they're doing, and then you're facilitating them doing it.
Well, they have the knowledge. I remember the sort of the dawning moment for me was when I was doing one of those sort of bazooka risk assessments in the Philippines. And it was a largely expert management team, all folded arms back with the way things are done in the Philippines. You were getting that kind of negative response. And then a local lady who was the head of finance stood up and said, no, if you want to come here and benefit from the human and resource capital of this country, the least you can do is try and improve the standards of governance. And by the way, on a weekly basis, we have to pay facilitation payments to get this occupancy permit, which we need to be able to do the construction of our hallmark project here. And they were all like, what? Yeah, you don't know this because you don't have to pay bribes to get the kids to see a doctor. I do. I live here. I understand it. And so when you can make yourself the ally of a person, because I have yet to meet, I know we're talking a lot about corruption, but it goes for environmental degradation, it goes for human rights, harassment, everything. I've yet to meet a single person in so-called quote unquote local who is happy with a poor governance status quo. And they're potentially your most powerful allies, but they can also be your biggest detractor if you patronize and alienate them. So the job is to help them to understand that you're there as to hopefully make their life better. There'll be maybe some difficult conversations beginning. I've generally found that the frontline folks are the biggest allies once you show kind of empathy and compassion for realities that they have to live with on a daily basis.
Yeah, no, I think the themes here are going to be like radical empathy, compassion, curiosity. We're going to have to keep leveraging those tools. You said you don't want to patronize and alienate people. I want to dig down a little bit there because we can't do our job if we do alienate and patronize people and then they make them less likely to share with us their stories. I have a bit of a conundrum I want to get your thoughts on. I think it's pretty obvious that one way to make risk relevant is to tell stories about your company. So if something's happened or you've had an investigation, you can anonymize it and share that. That's great. But oftentimes, what we're anonymizing is the harsh consequences of someone doing something wrong. And I'm not sure, while it has the benefit of saying, this happens at our company, you should hear this, it also tells them we're the police. And if you do it, there's no room for error and we've got zero tolerance. I know you've got a lot of thoughts on these issues, but I'd
Yeah.
love advice on how can you leverage the stories from the company or the industry or the sector wisely, navigating those two issues.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I why not start from the beginning? And so one of the things I've always really powerful with leadership teams who think that they tend to think they know maybe more than they do about these risk realities is to give them the initial, if you go back to the beginning of say that investigation, what was the first decision node where it went wrong? And if you've done your root cause analysis in the investigation, you have that data. And so then if you start from the scenario from that premise, and then you split people into groups and go, okay, what decisions are you going to make? And then you can see how multiple different outcomes can eventuate from that same starting point. And then you can say, this is what, at the end of it, you can say, this is what actually happened in the real case. But because by that point, you've allowed people some agency to make their own decisions and maybe fail for some of them in that safe space, then it becomes more about learning. Okay, let's rewind it. How could we make better decisions at each stage? And what can I do to help you make those better decisions? And what support would you have needed? And then I think that becomes, and if you have a kind of a framework in which to categorize that, I think it becomes helpful. So the current one I'm working on, which is not perfect, because I always want to have things that are mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, the MEC theory, is knowledge, access, accountability, and trust. If I look at poor decisions, they tend to be a function of a lack of knowledge, of access to people that can provide support or managers who are willing to actually own issues and take responsibility, a lack of accountability, fairly obvious, and a lack of trust. And that trust can also be around either realistic targets and the management good walk and all those kind of things. If you can see where the decisions that are going wrong, and this also goes to Cressy's fraud triangle, pressure, rationalization, opportunity. If we can start to put some taxonomies around those areas, it becomes a bit easier to go, okay, people need more support at these kind of critical nodes, at these critical junctures. So yeah, I think you can use that data, but rather than just talk people through, this is what happened, to let them live it, because we're always going to learn more by doing.
That's brilliant. Actually, that takes me beautifully to my next point. Another one of your quotes that I use, I really literally do use multiple times a day now. But I just want to set it up. You've talked about, the stories within the story, the decisions within the story, and just acknowledging that any situation is made up of multiple decisions,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So we talked about simplicity. There's an acknowledgement of the complexity of any situation, and also just simplifying it back down to the the series of decisions that was made, and like you said, the nodes and what we
Yeah.
could learn from them. So the quote the quote I take from you is, "Where good or honest intentions meet operational reality."
Yeah.
And I want to talk a lot about this one, but it's my favorite for a number of reasons. But just sticking to what we've just said, a lot of us as compliance and risk professionals focus on the intentions must be good and pure. And if
Yeah.
it goes wrong, here's when it went wrong. And don't spend enough time on the bridging that gap. Yes, anyone can sign on and say, I read the code. Yes, I'll do the right thing. But it's where the good intentions meet the operational reality where the real work is for us. Is that
Yeah.
a fair statement?
Absolutely. And one of the things that I've done on a number of occasions, I always like doing it with the audience that consider themselves the arbiters of it. So, for example, I've done a few lectures for a MBA in sustainability, and I've also done a few talks for like Association of Certified Fraud exams. So you've got a group of investigators there. And slide one, it's a mentee thing we can vote. I am an ethical person all the time, most of the time, some of the time, etc. And then we'll generally score ourselves around most of the time, the overwhelming majority, like
Mhm.
77%. And then the next slide is other people are ethical, exactly the same voting criteria. And it goes down to sub 50%. And so you go, okay, where's this gap? So you are those same ethical people and those same unethical people. You're just judging each other in this construct. And that's important to understand because ethics is about our intentions, whereas our actions is what others will see. They don't see our intentions. If I cut you up when I'm driving to work because I'm going to be late to collect my kid, I may justify that in my head. You're probably not going to feel so favorable. And so that I think when we have to first, it's not like some morality competition. We all are making trade-off decisions and rationalizing and justifying to ourselves. And so I guess that's the first step. It's like having the humility to recognize that we're not ethically perfect. And the second thing is that we often struggle with considering the second order consequences of our decisions. So I guess one of the things you're hoping to move people towards is having more psychological safety, which I know a big area of yours, to raise those concerns and have those discussions. Because when we make those critical decisions together, we tend to have better outcomes. There's so many cool decision-making frameworks out there. There's one that's been trending a lot at the moment, which is to do with, what was it, like haircuts and tattoos is the analogy. That's the decision that you need. You can live with a bad haircut. Potentially it's going to be a bit embarrassing. Is this a tattoo or a haircut decision? So there's so many different ways that you can add a bit of levity and make it destigmatize it from what often compliance is seeing is thou shalt not and right and wrong.
Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, again, and you only start thinking about those decision-making frameworks if you acknowledge that there are a series of complicated decisions and the
Right.
conditions dictate how easy it is to make that decision. Because in isolation, we're all going to go for the ethical decision. Then you start changing the conditions,
Yes.
it gets more of a conundrum again.
There was a particularly challenging one I heard recently. It's not particularly cheerful, but it's to try and explain our rationality is there's a child stuck in a dam and the child is going to die. You're the only person there. If you release the child, the dam will break and hundreds of people downstream will be drowned, but you can't see them because they're downstream. And a lot of people really struggle with that. But then as soon as you say it's your child, they no longer struggle with it at all. So we have to recognize that we will all make decisions about things that matter to our survival or things that we care about, even if they do have deleterious consequences for others. And that's not something to feel massive shame about. It's a human thing. And it's why decision making should be done with accountability and with other people if it's going to be critical to help with natural bias. Because of course you can't, I don't know about you, but if I think of all the investigations I've been involved in, the number of times it's somebody deliberately malintentioned who's out there for personal gain is a very small minority. The overwhelming majority of times is poor decision making or people under pressure. And that pressure is often driven by fear of losing their job, fear of not hitting their targets, fears. I think that if you're approaching people who are fearful from a position of judgment. It's really difficult. I remember one of the things I learned, I went back to postgrad studies in behavioral analysis and investigative interviewing. And one of the big things they talked to us about was, even if you find what the other person is alleged to have done repugnant, you cannot move them to a position of shame. Shame is directed at the self. Guilt is directed at the act. You have to allow people to discuss their guilt, where their actions and their decisions have been imperfect and how to do it better without moving into a position of shame. So I think that's quite important.
And again, the operational reality is it's not far-fetched what you're describing. Are employees under pressure? Are employees worried about losing their job? Are employees worried about being tainted as unethical
Yeah.
or being fired? These are real. This is
Yes.
the relevant conditions in which our employees operate, and we have to acknowledge that and then facilitate ethical decision making in those conditions. Some of it is we create those conditions as a company. Some of it is out of our control. Those conditions exist out there in the market, and we're making our employees vulnerable by sending them out there without equipping them to do this.
Yeah.
Yeah. And on that point, that reminds me then of in the US, President Biden signed an act in December criminalizing the demand side of bribery,
Yeah.
or an extortion prevention act. I know that the demand side is already unlawful in a number of jurisdictions, the UK, Germany, for example. But that's another acknowledgement that we're not saying it's you, but you're out there and you might be vulnerable to a bribe solicitation. Now what do you do? It reminds me of what my mum used to say when she didn't want me going out to parties or hanging out in the high street. She'd say, "It's not you I'm worried about, it's the world outside." And she was
Yeah.
trying to equip me for decision making in a world that she couldn't control. And I think that's something we need to think about as well. Again, not just our employees are an insider threat, but we're putting our employees in vulnerable situations, and we should
Yes.
equip them in those situations to keep them safe and the company safe and stay on the right side of the laws. I just want to raise that in terms of making risk relevant. What advice have you got in terms of helping our employees with that? One thing we use is near misreporting. So we get more information about the conditions that
Yeah.
employees are in, even if they were successful in saying no to a customs official. Come back and tell us how that went so we can teach others about a way to handle that in the field. Any thoughts you've got?
Oh, so many. I'll try and keep it brief. So I think the sharing across organizations. I remember hearing two people, country heads for Brazil and Russia at the time, talking about the certain schemes and scams that we're seeing, fraud, bribery, etc., and how similar it was, even though the countries are different. So I think one of the problems with a lot of organizations, it's natural in multinational, is the decentralization. So that if somebody solves something in Indonesia, that may have replicability elsewhere. So it's capturing those nuggets. And I think your near miss suggestion is fantastic. I think also that understanding, a lot of organizations do employee engagement, employee pulse, and there's a fair amount of cynicism, I felt, at least, because there isn't much action that follows up. There is trust in that process, and you are doing it genuinely and anonymously, and by which I mean no identifier should create a group size of 5 or less. Then you could start to shoehorn in a few sort of ethical questions, some basic ones like, I've identified someone with whom I can share an ethical concern, those type of things. So you can start to calibrate where people are maybe a bit isolated. But I think one of the big things that we don't talk about enough on the demand side is power differentials. And so I remember I remember hearing folks in, I think it's Coca-Cola in Myanmar, talking about how they equipped all their drivers with this card written in the Burmese of how that says, I can't pay or I'll lose my job. And they're Coca-Cola, and I can't understand that being effective. They can go straight to the ministerial level if they have a problem. For the rest of the world, that's not always a challenge. So you have that direct sort of influence of your organization issue, but also within the organization. So I remember working with one in Indonesia where the country manager had actually been fired for paying a bribe to get a client who'd been sort of possibly illegally detained or not, we don't know, for a visa violation. And so he raided the petty cash to pay to get that distressed female client out of this sort of unpleasant detention center. And that then sent shockwaves through the organization. So none of the middle management would touch interactions with the customs and the police. And it fell to the office manager, who was a female in her probably late 20s, early 30s, and she started getting sexually harassed. And so I didn't know this until I stepped in the room. My job was to try and understand the extent of the problem within just general bribery within the organization. And I was doing the interview with her, and she started breaking down and crying as she started to explain what actually happened. And they were sending someone in that culture where hierarchies matter, into a environment where the demand side were very powerful and senior and blah, blah, blah. So I think there's a huge amount to be done there, but when I say a huge amount, I don't want people to be daunted. The answers are quite quickly available when you ask the right people,
There we go.
but it's making sure that we understand where that kind of demand side, power dynamics sits. It's back to terrorism. Terrorism, we start with threat, and threat is a function of credibility and capability. So I remember one client in Thailand did a huge bribe request from a deputy transport minister. And ultimately, they didn't have the credibility. They were only in power for 6 months more. You could wait it out. Their star was waning. They weren't going to get reelected. So in theory, minister seemed quite powerful, but actually the credibility of the threat was low. Their capability was low. Often the cop on that rural road has high credibility and high capability to stop and make your life a misery. So I think when I'm speaking to organizations, I try and put it into whatever the lexicon is that organization uses. Is it critical path? Is it value chain? How do they discuss their business operations, doing the thing that they do to make it successful? And when you put it in those terms and you go, where might that demand side derail us if we refuse? That's where you get to the goal straight away, and you can start to really work with people on looking at alternative incentives, rerouting, capacity building, seeking allies, social license, all of the tools that you have to mitigate. And the final thing with demand side is understand how it works. So often, if you talk about that cop example, that cop will be rotated into that revenue generating role for maybe 2-3 years. In that period, they're expected to filter a portion of the bribes they extort the channel. So it works like an organized crime syndicate, basically. Right. And once you understand that, it becomes a lot more, maybe easier to work. Well, maybe we need to do collective bargaining with the government. Maybe we need to look at e-licensing. Maybe we need to start to offer these cops better incentives, not to make our lives misery, like giving them sometimes something as simple as giving them access to our canteen that's air conditioned over their lunch. So we're talking about tactical solutions to these problems that sit on your critical path and then could be abated relatively quickly. But you have to do that mapping based on criticality for it to be relevant to people.
Yeah, just back to the most basic level, you have to be curious, like you said, asking the right questions. We can't just be telling people to handle it. Like, go get this thing done and don't bribe. We have to say, okay, what's the operation reality, the activity that activities you must engage in to get this thing done, and how can we mitigate the risks there?
Yeah.
Meet you where you are, meet you where you're going, as opposed to, as I said, this high level, check off your training, promise you're going to be good and have good intentions, and goodbye. It's not enough. And I think, again, this is the epitome for me of making risk management relevant. I could go on and on with this one, but we're going to move to the second one about not making risk realistic, right? Let's talk about realistic. So I know you talk about your book, Strapping Ethics, as the title suggests, is for those trying to do the right thing, but usually with insufficient resources, limited resources, insufficient data, maybe even with recalcitrant or hostile stakeholders. My question to you then about being realistic, are we being realistic about whether a few good men or women in a compliance function could have any impact at scale?
Not if you're acting in opposition to the organizational goals. So if we're being really honest, unfortunately, one of the conversations I have most is with people in-house, friends, ex-colleagues, clients, etc., who just hit that wall and they leave. So I think that if you're, and I know it's bleak, but there still is the reality. And I think that if you can find an organization that is genuinely committed to this, then obviously your chances of changing increase hugely. But if you are one of those people stuck in an organization where maybe it seems that the kind of recognition of these issues is not sufficient or progress is glacial, I would just start somewhere, and ideally start somewhere that's aligned with the strategic goals of the organization. And so then once you can demonstrate value there, it's going to be easier. And so it all comes back to the same thing. It's about prioritization. And if we're talking about most organizations I've seen, even big ones, you can hone down those issues. If we're honest, they're going to truly derail them to a handful. And so I know there's a universe of things we have to comply with. I would draw a distinction between paper compliance and having the policies in place and having things. If we talk about the doing and the application and you're struggling, just start with those bits that are allied with business objectives, not contrary. And there will, even in a difficult organization, you might have a couple of places you can start.
Yeah, and this is powerful advice for our listeners, not just about being realistic and having impact, but also just wellness and avoiding burnout, right? If you can focus on where you will have the most impact. Again, another talk track I've got of yours written down here is you've said your focus is on the root causes of rot, not
Yeah.
treating risk malaise. And I think getting to the root cause is part of that prioritization, part of making risk relevant. We can have more impact at scale if we stop whack-a-moling the symptoms and
Yeah.
start thinking about the cause. So yeah, tell us more about why you say that and how you've seen that in operation.
I'm giving another my slightly tedious buzzwords is risk loves company. And I learned that when I was working on a project with a Japanese organization, and it was fascinating. They first approached me and said, "We've identified that there's systemic facilitation payments problems in one of our Southeast Asian subsidiaries. Is this common?" And we talked through, yes, it's common. Are these stakeholders problematic? Yes, and others have had similar experiences. And they were, okay, we'll call you. And then 3 months passed, and then they called and said, "Did we have another chat?" So I went in again. And it was, all right, so we went and asked our other 11 subsidiaries, and 9 of them are experiencing variations, albeit different stakeholders, but variations of the same theme, this sort of extortion, demand side stuff. I was like, okay, is this common? Are these sectors? So it went through it again. Do you want to do anything about it? No. And I acknowledge that Japanese organizations are working with different stakeholder frameworks to those registered in other parts of the world. They're operating on different timeframes where people will tolerate lower returns, so they can move at that more gradual pace. I acknowledge all of that. And so that is not possible for everyone to do. But then the next 3 or 6 months passed this time, and then went back and they said, we looked at everything. We looked at speak up data. We looked at workplace health and safety incidents. We looked at employee exits, accident logs, everything. And we noticed that the subsidiaries where you have like lackadaisical health and safety instances of discrimination, harassment, etc., are having the biggest sort of fraud, corruption, other exposures. And then so we start to look at it. And it's when you say it's glaringly obvious, but if you have a culture that tolerates the small, seemingly small sort of violations, someone having a drink at lunch and then getting on the forklift or whatever it is, you have a leadership culture that is basically condoning poor behavior. And if they're often also then involved in discrimination and harassment, the people working for them are hardly going to feel motivated to uphold standards, go the extra mile. They might even dip their hands in the jar, do petty frauds, that type of stuff. And the people at the top will just get emboldened. We know this from all the fraud data that frauds escalate. And so it goes for other risks, not just these sort of financial crime ones. And I think that is, I've forgotten the beginning of the question, but yeah, it's looking at risk as a cultural kind of ecosystem and behaviors as something that's highly interlinked and highly interconnected. And I think we can all relate to it. If you think about all of the jobs you've had, I'm sure you can think of one where you really didn't go the extra mile. And we know why that was, because there were probably poor behaviors tolerated.
Yeah, you're speaking my love language when we talk about how you have to focus on the conditions and the culture as the root
Yeah.
cause of all the other behaviors that might be symptomatic. I know you've written a lot about that, and as listeners will see, I'm quoting a lot of the things from your book. Your book was so good, I bought it twice. I bought the hard copy, but I hate marking up my books. I love my books. So I bought the Kindle version so that I could highlight all your quotes in there. I definitely recommend our listeners check in for some tips on how you do culture. And if we've got time, we'll go through it today. I want to just go back to one other thing, though, that you say when it comes to about being realistic. And this is one where I think we can have a bit of a bun fight, because I think it's a really interesting thing you say in your book. Values can be aspirational on one argument. So can objectives. You can want to put some stretch goals in for your employees. You've said building a culture of integrity is impossible if you're simultaneously setting corporate objectives that are unrealistic. And I'm
Yeah.
saying unrealistic and aspirational might be the same thing in this argument. So on a
Yeah.
regional analysis, if they're unrealistic, they might require corner cutting and unethical dealings to be met.
Yeah.
My question to you is, look, in a time where the economy is challenged, companies need to stretch and lean into outsized performance to survive. Industries are facing sector-wide layoffs. Yes, we might be asking our employees to do more with less.
I think that's a good point. I think maybe my wording could have been better. I think unrealistic, maybe disjointed from reality. So let me give a practical example of an organization that managed to do both. So they had a near miss, and that near miss was a very terrifying near miss for them. It was like a really bad one. And then they were involved in construction and infrastructure. And they could do it. They could do everything from like a condo build right through to a defense installation. They did big construction, and they were operating it. This is when I'm based in Asia, across Southeast Asia. And they came to us and they said, like one of the big strap cut houses, like Booz Allen, something like that. They've done the market opportunity, and they tell us which of all these subsectors and which these countries present the best opportunity. And we're under the cosh financially. This is during one of the slumps in construction, and but which of this is the ethically addressable market? And so they were using ethics and risk as a counterbalance to market opportunity and finding a tolerance that they could live with.
Mm.
And then you can resource it properly. For example, like if the state dominates certain subsectors and they're particularly corrupt, then maybe we focus on mixed use real estate. Or if this sub-region in the country, there's a powerful kind of local cabal, then we avoid that. And so I think you can definitely do, but risk has to become part of strategy.
Yeah.
So when it becomes part of strategy, you can hit those stretch goals. It can remain aspirational, but it's still realistic because you've actually bothered to factor risk in as this risk is not binary. It exists on a curve. We all have a tolerance for it. It's finding that right balance and just going in with eyes wide open and going, and often that will spark some really good lateral thought and some really good strategic thinking. And so to give a really simple example, another one was an organization that had massive time penalties if they failed to hit certain milestones in a project for a client. And they were getting derailed by demand side extortive requests on a particular route. And then we just looked at other routes and other ways that you can get certain things into that site and licenses and permits. I said, but the two can coexist. The risk has to have a place at the strategic table. It can't be where it often is, which is we've enacted strategy, now go and de-risk it after the fact.
Yeah. I mean, actually, I'm going to go one step further. It could sometimes be our strategy is this. We know times are tough, but just wing it, right? We don't even spend any time asking the questions on the risk. So first, be curious about the risk, whether proactively or reactively. But obviously, ideally, I think I'm hearing you say, this goes back to objective-centered risk management. At the time you set your goals and objectives, think about what might get in the way, the dependencies, and the risk is one of them. And the conditions and the culture should be right up there. Like what if we set this stretch goal, how might our teams react and what can we do to mitigate that in advance? I think is what I'm
It's
hearing.
where they need people like you. And there's an increasing sort of cadre of people with your attitude, which is to be a partner to the business and to be someone who's coming there with your role is to problem solve and help them find a way how to, not tell them what not to do. And so I think that when the people in the in-house risk compliance, what legal functions are approaching it collaboratively at that strategic thing, go, okay, that's what we want to do. That's what we want to get to. Let's see how we can do this. And they become part of the problem solving apparatus. I think that's the happy place.
Yeah, and look, so that segues beautifully into the next piece about psychological safety in the culture, the mitigating culture. One of them is psychological safety. Again, keep quoting you, but you say people should talk more, right? You say what you've just said doesn't come naturally. You have to be willing to talk to your managers about why you think the stretch goal might be unattainable if we don't do X, Y, and Z, or why we might need more resources to successfully unlock this market as opposed to just wing it. So let's talk about psychological safety. Before we go into the deep depths of it, I think you and I do something very similar. We allow catharsis, your word. We allow catharsis by asking our business partners what their perceptions are of the function, right? And letting them just say, and I think you, again, I'm quoting you, someone told you compliance is a steamroller sent to crush the business. I do a Miro board exercise doing the same thing. I'm like, what does the business think of compliance? I try to do the catharsis piece, just again, starting to model psychological safety. You can tell me if we can do better. And I get things like, you're the police, you're the blocker, you slow us down, you're too wordy, that it's good.
Carbon of no, yeah, fun, please.
Move your ego to the side because you need to hear it, because that's the first step of the trust building. Tell me a bit more about the catharsis piece and what motivates you to do that, and then we'll go to psychological safety writ large.
Just to as a kind of to break that tension, because often what I'm sure you found it is that the compliance functions for the most part, or risk, whatever it's called in the organization, sit either headquarters or regional headquarters. And so they then go into this environment where people might know your email, but they don't know you yet. And there's no trust and there's no sort of rapport and relationship. and they're fearful. Often you go into, I don't know about you, but I've gone into those environments where people are just like, tell us what to do. That's the attitude, and that it's not seen as a particularly collaborative relationship. And so if you can break down some stuff by sort of humanizing yourself and showing that you can have a laugh at it, and then it's easier to move it towards something a bit more collaborative. And then you can say, okay, take it on board. So let's work today on how we can change that and how we can help you do the things that you need to do. And once you get that, you'll find people will suddenly feel emboldened. I remember in Vietnam, where you do have a relatively hierarchical traditional society in many cases, so that sometimes people might be a bit reticent about speaking truth to power. And the regional CEO, who's like a sort of mythical figure and went up from Singapore for this training, and somebody just put their hand up and said, look, you keep asking 20% growth targets. That's going to push us into working with the state-owned enterprises. And they're super hairy from an integrity point of view. So if you want 20% growth, then you're going to need to front up, be in this market more and go to those meetings, because they're less likely to pull the funny business with you. And that again speaks to the power dynamic. Often you can mitigate bribe and extortion requests by just having someone powerful and showing a face in the room. And the CEO looks shocked and he's okay, fair enough. I am asking a lot of you. I need to back you. But that conversation I don't think would have happened if it hadn't had that initial. We recognize we're not always, we can be perceived as blockers, not enablers. So let's just get over that hurdle.
Yeah, exactly. Call out the elephant in the room, and then you begin the journey of changing those perceptions and knowing that's a priority. Ignorance is bliss, but actually the knowledge is power, right? And I know you give an example of a gentleman, I don't remember who it was, now you have to remind me, that did his regional tour and just put one slide with his phone number on the slide.
That's not, that was so Charles Pavet, who's now at the World Economic Forum, he told me that he said that he was working one of his previous jobs and they got a new compliance manager who had never done compliance before, which came from marketing. And what in marketing, the key thing is call to action. What action do you want people to do? And what he realized, because he didn't have the compliance background, but also because nobody seemed to know in that organization at that time, was what's actually going on. How do I make it super easy for people to tell me what's going on? I give them my private mobile phone number so that they can actually directly, I'm no longer this faceless thing of compliance. And apparently, I didn't see firsthand, but apparently that person went on to become a very successful sort of operator in that role.
Yeah, no, very inspiring to me too. You want that one slide, what can you do? And that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
Build trust, make yourself available, start to create that space. You can have something.
Another mutual contact of ours, Kevin Withane, did a very smart thing at TI Fluent Systems. He set himself a goal of doing 2 calls a week for the whole year. So he got into about 100 calls, randomly picking people out of the internal phone book and just calling them up 20 minutes, half an hour and going, what can I do for you? Tell me your pain. And how can I be of service? So he just approached it like that. And he said at the end of it, he understood his business a million times better than he would have done if he'd done the usual roadshow. And it was necessitated during that COVID era where he couldn't travel anyway and do the normal roadshows and compliance workshops. And so it got that. He said he felt it was probably the most powerful thing in his whole time in that role.
No, that's brilliant. I know Kevin, that's great. Maybe he'll be my next great gentleman on the podcast. Yeah, I remember doing a similar thing, thinking about my first 100 days in this role. And I made a point of doing 100 one-on-ones. So I was like, I'm going to meet everyone. And that was just a good number for me to get to. So yeah, it can be really powerful. It's a good investment. The other thing, one definition for me of psychological safety is encouraging people to say the quiet parts out loud, right? A space where people will say what's traditionally been the quiet part out loud. That might be hard. That might be difficult. You have an exercise which is called Excuses Bingo, which I think is a really good way. So talk to the audience about Excuses Bingo and how, at least I'm saying that's a way to say the quiet part out loud. These are all my excuses for not speaking up, whatever it might be. You get it out there and then you can fix it. But why do you use, what is Excuses Bingo and how do you use it?
It's what is the best ethical excuses you've heard, and sometimes you may need to give a few nudges. I was doing it for the good of the company is a common one. It wasn't us; it was our agent. And so you may need to nudge at the start. But what you're trying to do is a number of things. Is add some levity because you'll get some wild ones in there which are quite funny, but also you'll get some thematic topics. And for example, it might be I didn't have time to follow the proper process. I was under pressure, and so you start to then go, what are some of the themes we're seeing here? Is it where everyone's moving at a million miles an hour and therefore they don't have time to follow due process. In that case, what do we need to do to improve process? And I see this one a lot. And then you go rework it. I remember one organization quite recently where you're having a lot of that. And then when we looked into process, they've grown threefold in the space of many years. So there's a huge scale up of the organization. And that had necessitated loads more suppliers, providers, not done in a very strategic sense. And the procurement and legal contract teams hadn't been adequately resourced, perhaps. So it was taking sometimes like 8 weeks to get stuff through. So, of course, in that environment, people are skipping and cutting corners, but you don't get to that without understanding what are the thematic reasons that. And so it just becomes is a diagnostic tool that adds a bit of levity and also helps us when we see it up there start to reflect on the ones that perhaps we use or we can empathize with. Because again, back to the demand side or supply side internally, there's reasons for that. If you think about what we're trying to do, you're essentially, if you think about good policing, there's not many examples of that at the moment, but it's meant to be about, there's that community support element right through to the disciplinary. And so you need to be understanding of what are the conditions, this environment, right from the very micro that are contributing to what we're seeing is the result.
I mean, look, the analogy is back to the customer experience and what are we selling. If you're wondering why people aren't stopping at your storefront, maybe check about whether there's parking outside, right? Like check what's
Yeah,
getting in their way, and you could be getting in your own way with you, as you said, the difficulty of the process, the tool's not working, we're not responding in a timely fashion. And that's when we can really unlock this, right? Think about the compliance customer experience. Start thinking as we would as a retail store, not is our product great or why don't people come, but what's getting in the way of them coming to the store?
exactly.
You're
And
big
also,
with that. Yeah.
yeah, and then you'll find something in every organization I've interacted with. There are some elements of risk that are managed expertly, and then you can start to leverage on it. So another example of that was an organization that was really on top of their health, safety, and environment stuff, very proud about their good record. And then they had a very near miss on a sanctions issue because someone under a rush dealing with a procurement team that they were overburdened, and they used their credit card, which had a very high limit because they were a senior exec, to buy something that probably should have gone through a contracting procurement process because they needed it now.
Mhm.
And that was just one item. It had very little health and safety consequences, like a turbine to power and something. And when it arrived, they bought it on eBay through what they thought was the UK, and then it came with a packing label from the Syria-Turkey border. And they're like, oh, okay. And so that's a really good example because you can, instead of castigating them for, oh, you had a near miss on a sanctions violation, you can go, well, you think about it if you start to think about some of these other risk issues, the same way you do the health and safety, where you really think through the consequences, you do your assessment. And again, when you're doing anything that breaks the ice with people, people want to talk about themselves and talk about the things they do well. And it gives you a chance to tap into where don't you hear these excuses? What are we doing really well? And then there'll be, it doesn't matter whether it's InfoSec or whether it's, I don't know, your finance compliance for the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, there'll be some part of something that they do in the risk world super well. And it gives you a chance to tease that out.
Yeah, no, I love that. Leverage the strengths that you've got as well. I love that. A little bit on in psychological safety, then we'll move on to the last topic. I know we could go on forever. I love this conversation, but let's just talk a little bit about the importance of psychological safety. I want to underscore that. I know Amy Edmondson does a lot of work on this, and you've quoted yourself. You said when people don't feel they can safely raise concerns, have an impact, or admit mistakes, they will be unlikely to uphold whatever values or missions to which you ascribe. Love that. What is the culture of psychological safety, and how can we encourage one?
I will start by saying people like Amy are way better, quick to talk to it in depth than I am. The way I look at it through the risk lens is, again, about knowledge, access, accountability, and trust. And in particular, if we're focusing on the trust element, it's understanding the questions you just raised. So we need to understand that we need to plan for when people come forward, how we're going to protect them, how we're going to safeguard them, how we're going to be honest about things like anonymity and confidentiality, which may not be guaranteed if they're raising an allegation that, let's say, only two parties know. And it's about, again, it's an element of transparency. But I think one of the big things is demystify, again, it's curse of knowledge stuff. My daughter at the moment, she's 13, she's really into forensic pathology. And so one of the things that a 13-year-old is struggling with is that how many times the legal system isn't able to how convictions can fail through technicalities, chain of evidence, all this kind of stuff. When we start to actually demystify what happened after you make that call, you speak up, or when you make a suggestion, I think that's very powerful because if you think of, I don't know about you, but in my professional career as as being an employee, if you like, I was only involved once in what you might call an internal investigative matter, and even then it was just peripheral witness. And so I never got to see how that organization actually ran the Speak Up and Investigations framework. It's this alien thing to me that does confer an element of fear. And so we need to explain honestly about, well, what happens, some of the challenges in investigation, how it's not always possible to do things the way we'd like, sometimes because of local legislation and blah, blah, blah. And I think that is part of it. If you're talking about the speaker, if you're talking more about, I'd say, I don't know, I disagree, or basically speaking truth to power or admitting that you've made a mistake, then that's the more core psychological safety bit. And the advice that I got from people who specialize in that and are experts in it is you have to be asking those questions regularly with enough demographic data to know where the vulnerable people sit, but not so much that they're no longer anonymous, which is why this minimum group size of 5 exists. So if you're asking for like job location and team, you've got to make sure that doesn't reduce the identifiers below than 5. When you have the demographic data, then you can really start to see certain patterns within your organization where the people are maybe unable to raise concerns at that local team level. And then it becomes easier for you as the compliance or risk manager to have the sort of those kind of mini interventions to find out what's going on, which I know links to another topic of interest to you, the mood in the middle, because you need to have that pairing of those good questions. I feel comfortable raising concerns. I've identified someone with whom I can discuss an ethical challenge. I feel heard by my manager, blah, 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 blah. I question, so it's easy for us to ask, not my manager. So it's a good example because that's a difficult question to answer because to whom? In what example of what? That is too vague. So you have to have really good questions, the I questions, easy for the person to answer. Use the right scale so that you can reflect nuance. Some of these things aren't binary. And then have enough demographic data to be able to identify where you have the hotspots.
Yeah, no, I love that because one of my questions was going to be how are we going to encourage the middle managers, people managers to create conditions of psychological safety, like practically speaking. It's one thing to say you must, that's easy, but actually to learn that skill, and it's not instinctive for a manager who might be afraid themselves. So yeah, really practical. I love the questionnaire. I love perhaps the survey where you get to improve your score, right? And not the scores. That's brilliant. Okay, let's turn to the last of the 3 themes. I know we haven't left ourselves enough time for this, but to do it justice, but let me just ask you, what do you mean by right-sizing risk?
There's multiple elements. It's having it fit with your organizational capacity, strategy, stakeholder needs. It's that sort of the prioritization. So I guess maybe it's easier to give an example of what it shouldn't be, which is what the analogy I use is sharks and mosquitoes. Sharks, it's big and scary. They kill 12 to 15 of us per annum, but generally we know where they operate, and there are often relatively good kind of controls and warnings in those places, so you enter at your own peril. To me, a shark risk is like getting called for tender rigging, bribery, or massive insider trading. Unfortunately, most organizations, particularly SMEs, they're told by their lenders and their customers and investors that's where you should be starting. But if we're really honest, I don't think massive, large-scale corruption is always the most relevant area for every organization to start. And I know I'm picking that one example, but it's the biggest example of a shark risk, or maybe anti-competition. The really scary, massive regulatory actions. Mosquitoes kill 2 to 3 million people a year. They carry multiple different diseases in different environments. They're notoriously difficult to stop, and you have to operate in environments where they exist. That's a more relatable risk framework for most organizations. And that might be everything from what I would call the culture killing things like discrimination and harassment through to fraud and that, or environmental degradation, whatever it may be, things that are maybe not as immediately obvious, instantly obvious. And so when it's about right sizing, again, it's going back to what's critical to that organization, both in terms of the inputs to their impact, and then starting there. I'm not saying you ignore corruption. I'm just saying that unfortunately, I see organizations where they put like some big CPA type policy as the centerpiece of their code of conduct when they're, I don't know, a scale up e-learning company that's holding hundreds of thousands of people's personal data. And you're like, where's the data privacy, information security, cybersecurity framework? They're like, oh, we haven't got to that. We got insurance for that because they were told by the bank they had to have an ABC policy. And so I think the right science is about a genuine understanding of where your strategy and operations meet risk reality.
Yeah, no, I love that. You and I talked about this earlier in terms of the microcultures that might exist within a company, within a country, within a
Yeah,
region. And so you can also scale what you've just said to right size per region or right size per country.
absolutely. And yeah, exactly. And that's why we're getting down to like function specific training. So I remember in a previous role that I was in Singapore at the time, and everyone in the organization had to do active shooter training because there'd been a number of incidents that had come out of the States. And maybe I traveled to the States and I also traveled to places like Philippines where there is some access to firearms. So perhaps it was relevant to me, but there were people in, say, the finance team in Singapore for whom that was wholly irrelevant, but they still had to go through the 45-minute training. And so I think a lot of organizations are now seeing a kind of right sizing the training to make it either more bite-sized for audiences that are much less likely to interact with it, or tailored to where it would intersect with their reality. You know, the fraud risks procurement team face are very different to business development. And so that it's just making sure it's a great point to make sure that you're actually hitting people with information that's really salient and germane to what they do, which we can do now. We have the data around employee roles and their access and everyone's online. So it's possible to segment internal comms and marketing campaigns. And that's the final point I guess I'd make on this topic is it's not always about training. Under the guidance, it's always training. Communication sometimes comes a poor second because training is recordable. I understand that. And you can tick that box. The comms often is what's much more powerful for people. If you're able to give them like a cheat sheet, top 10 red flags to look for in procurement, the procurement team might be much more happier. Top 10 red flags to look for when onboarding a supplier. That might be much more useful to them than a kind of training that they do once or twice a year.
No, that's brilliant. I don't want to end this conversation. So much rich content for me and for the listeners. Let me just ask you, Rupert, to let our listeners know where they can find you, where they can find your book, your newsletter. Just give them a quick hint because there's so much more I promise you to get from Rupert. And you should go out and buy your 2 copies.
Well, thank you. LinkedIn is probably the easiest place to find me. Luckily, I've got a fairly unique name, so there's only like 3 of us I think I found in the world so far. And so that would be the easiest place. And then under my LinkedIn bio, I have that link, or I think it's called My Portfolio, whatever it's called. And that takes you to a link tree where you can find the book, where there's a bunch of free resources, some free assessment. I've just finished writing a kind of 20 risk and sustainability hacks document. You can download there, subscribe to newsletters. I put it all in the link tree because I found that's a bit easier for people to navigate than a website.
And that's brilliant. And just you mentioned some of the infographic type things you can give by way of communications. You've got some of those in your book. So if people are stuck for
Yeah.
ideas there, I think there is a top 10 red flags for gifting or something like that in there, for example. So
Yeah, it was good because again, when I was in Asia, it was such a common thing. So I just people would come up with all kinds of good questions. So you just have to break it down into, I probably would reorder that graphic doing it now. I'd start with why. I think maybe I did start with why. Why are we doing this? Because that often will kill all of the subsequent questions if you can't come up with a good reason. But then what, when, proportionality, what is it? When are you doing it? Blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I love breaking things down into what, where, who questions because they are often easier for people to remember.
they certainly are. As you can tell, lots of what you've said has been very easy for me to remember, very impactful. I do use it daily. So thank you, Rupert, for what you're doing for all of us. Thank you for coming on the podcast to share it with more people. And we'll definitely have you back to talk about some of the things we didn't get to today, like mood in the middle, parenting and compliance. We want to talk about that. So we'll have you back for another round. But thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure and enjoy.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for the great questions.